Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carol Trone. I'm Executive Director of the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt, otherwise known as Debt Smarts. And we are here this afternoon for our Tuesday 30-minute webinar to talk about student loan default, what it is, how to avoid it, and how to resolve it. Our presenter today is Benjamin Lee. And before I hand this over to Benjamin, I'll just give you a little overview of what we do at the coalition. So, what is Debt Smarts? We are a statewide nonprofit organization. We're committed to helping students minimize their student loan debt and borrowers avoid unmanageable student loan debt. So it's an expansive mission. What we do is we help students throughout their journey. Before college, what that looks like is we provide resources for free FAFSA help and tips. We run a Money Smart contest every winter and spring for about 15 $1,000 scholarship opportunities. During college, we also share out resources about with upcoming scholarship opportunities and budgeting. And then after college, we offer a free confidential student loan helpline and additional resources for borrowers to understand how to navigate their loans and pay them. All right, hand it over to you, Benjamin.
All right, thanks, Carol. All right, so nice little short webinar today, and here's what we're going to be covering. So, default isn't anything that folks really like to talk about or address or think about, but it's a big deal, and it has a lot of sort of implications, not just for the borrower, but for folks around them. So I want to get into, what it is, understanding it. If you're someone that works at a school or works with borrowers, this is, even if it doesn't apply to you, it's a great thing to know. Folks in default a lot of times have just sort of checked out of the system. And if you're someone who can be a resource for someone who might be struggling, the more knowledge, the better. So what is student loan default? For federal loans, we're talking about technical default at day 270. So you really have to be delinquent for a very long time to go into default on a federal student loan. 360 days is sort of the end of your possible delinquency, and at that point, you are definitely in default. Previous administrations have usually given borrowers close to that 360 before they would say that they were in default. The current administration seems to be a little bit all over the place and not quite as uniform, but we have seen some borrowers where the department puts them into default at day like 280, 290, a little bit more aggressive. There's also federal Perkins loans, which are loans made by the school, and there the holder can declare default if payment isn't made by the due date pretty much instantaneously. I'm not going to really be talking about private student loans during this webinar, but for those loans, just know that default is determined by that individual loan product. It has a different definition or time frame depending on what type of private loan you've taken out. So how to avoid default? Very important. Um, First and foremost, like almost every single webinar on student loans I ever give, got to have your accounts set up and with updated contact information with both studentaid.gov, that is the federal website for all things student loans, as well as your loan servicer. So that is the company that the federal government hires to sort of handle student loans. So you're talking about Nelnet, Mohila, Ed Financial. These are the names of some of the big student loan companies right now. So make sure that account information is up to date, contact information is up to date. Otherwise, if you're going delinquent, there is no way that you will know that you're going delinquent. There won't be any notifications. Number two might seem obvious, but make payments. A lot of folks I know prioritize student loan payments way below many other monthly obligations because there's nothing that can be sort of recouped, right? You can get your electricity shut off, they can repo your car, but they can't take away your education or credential. And I understand that. But there's still some very good reasons to continue making payments or other arrangements on your student loans and not ignoring them. Income-driven repayment is a plan for repaying your student loans that's based on your income and your family size. And these payments can be as low as $0 or $10 a month, depending on your income level. So getting into one of these plans can be really helpful for folks that have difficulty affording any of the other plans. And there's various flavors of IDR plans under that umbrella. So IDR is income driven repayment. And if you can't even afford, whatever the payment amount is on an IDR plan, if that is still too much, which it can absolutely be if you have medical debt, private student loans, any other economic factors at play, please explore deferments and forbearances. These are temporary sort of pause payment mechanisms that people have a right to under the Higher Education Act. They're not great in terms of, interest keeps running for the most part, and you're not making progress on student loan towards student loan forgiveness in most cases. But they are way better than going delinquent or defaulting. And the number one thing, other than just having your account information and contact information up to date, is talk to whoever holds your loan. Don't ignore it. Don't shy away from it, even if it's uncomfortable. They want to help you. They don't want you to go delinquent and default, and neither do you. So be in touch with them. So if you go delinquent and eventually default, there's a lot of bad things that can happen. And I'm going to be talking mostly about just default here, but a little bit of delinquency too. So the first up is damaged credit score. Credit scores are increasingly being used to, uh, you know, qualify people for all sorts of things. So it's not just interest rate or a car loan or a mortgage. It can be a job. It can be a apartment, a rental, really significant things. And what a lot of people who don't have student loans don't understand is that each individual loan is a credit line on your credit report. I went to law school and took out uh, loans. I have 12 credit lines just from those 2.5 years student loans. So when you miss a payment for student loans, it can tank your score 150, 200 points, depending on your credit profile. That is catastrophic for many borrowers. When you default, the whole balance becomes due. That is known as acceleration. You can have your tax refunds and any other federal benefits offset, which is withheld. And a lot of times folks getting the biggest, tax refunds are the ones that can least afford to have those refunds intercepted. If you're working, your wages can be garnished. There doesn't need to be any sort of court order. It is written into the Higher Education Act that it's sort of automatic that your wages can be garnished. You can't access options like deferments or forbearance. You can't take out additional federal student loans, which is a killer for people who maybe have student loan debt but didn't complete their credential or degree and want to go back to school. If they can't take out more aid, they probably can't afford to go back. If they have a default, they need to take care of that before they would get more aid. And on top of all that, there's very significant collection costs and fees. Some, it can be as high as like 16, 20% in federal loans. That's just additional money that you have to pay back later. Again, lots of bad things happen when you default on a federal student loan. All right, so how can you resolve a defaulted student loan? I'll sound a little bit like a broken record here, but first up is contact your loan holder. They want to hear from you. They've probably been trying to reach you. So if you're in trouble, figure out who has your student loan. You can do that on studentaid.gov. If you don't have an account there, you can create one and it'll show you all of your federal student loans and who the holder or servicer is and how to contact them. It's a great resource. So let's say that you've contacted them. They're going to give you some options on how to resolve that default. And we're going to go through a couple real quickly here. So one is consolidation. That is just taking out a new loan to pay off your defaulted loans. So this is probably the fastest way to get out of default, but in some respects, it doesn't really necessarily solve whatever issue led you to defaulting in the first place. But if you need to get out of default quickly, or it's a one-time sort of thing that you let happen and you're pretty sure that that's not going to be a problem going forward, consolidation might be right for you. It essentially capitalizes your interest. It can also stretch out your repayment terms because under a consolidation loan, you can have up to 30 years of repayment depending on the balance. Um, so something to be examined there. Next up, another way out of default for federal student loans is called rehabilitation. The idea here being that the system wants to encourage borrowers to get used to making monthly payments. So what rehabilitation does is if you make 9 qualifying monthly payments over a 10-month period, you are out of default and you are put back into good standing. So They have to be made on time. It's a equation that's similar to IDR in terms of what you can pay per month. It can be as low as $5 per month. So a lot of times these are not big payments. It's really about that muscle memory of, all right, make this payment every month, show you can do it, and you're out of default. One of the downsides for rehabilitation is you can only rehabilitate a loan once. So if you've defaulted in the past and rehabilitated, it's not an option. The new OB3 law, One Big Beautiful Bill, uh, one of the provisions in there makes it so that you can now rehabilitate a loan a second time, but that does not come into play until July 1 of 27. So it's not yet available, but it will be. Another way that you can sort of slowly get out of the default is a repayment plan where you just pay off the loan with like monthly payments over time that will pay off the whole balance. The downside here is that you're going to be in default until you pay it all the way off. It doesn't get you out of default, but loan holders, servicers, EDs, collection agencies, when they have them set up, will all set these up if that's what someone wants to do. And the last one might seem silly and obvious, but payment in full, you know, I've seen borrowers who have defaulted on as little as, 40 or $50 that they just didn't know existed. It's insane that the system even allows that to happen. A lot of times people can just say, all right, yeah, I got that money lying around. Let's get rid of this, be done with it. Something I want to kind of focus on here when we're talking about default is the current environment and why this topic is sort of maybe more in the press and more front of mind than normal. So recall that during the pandemic, there was a student loan pause for federally held student loans. And so that was the whole, for years, no one had to make a payment on their student loans and nothing bad would happen if they didn't make that payment, right? There wasn't any negative credit reporting. Um, the time that they were there, in good standing counted towards forgiveness. You really didn't have to pay attention to your student loans at all. On top of that, there was some messaging from the previous administration about loan forgiveness. I'm sure some of the folks on remember the lawsuits and going to the Supreme Court and whether the Biden administration had the authority to forgive large swaths of student loans. Um, that plan was struck down, but lots of messaging went out during the pandemic saying, hey, your loans have been selected for forgiveness or there will be forgiveness. Um, it's hard to reverse that messaging and then get people into the mindset of, okay, this is actually something I need to pay attention to again after years, and I'm going to have to be making monthly payments that I never budgeted for. It's a big switch for borrowers. And when the pandemic itself ended, the Department of Education also had what was called an on-ramp. So it was an additional year where payments were due and you would get notices that you had payments due, but again, there was no credit reporting. So some of the worst parts of, going delinquent and leading to default were not present and they weren't defaulting anyone. So you would get these notices, but for all intents and purposes, it wasn't like a real delinquency. And again, no one was defaulting. There were really no defaults except in maybe the FEL program and in private loans during the pandemic. So now all of a sudden, folks that have been checked out for years and years and received messaging that their loans may be selected for forgiveness or that there could be forgiveness are expected to start making monthly payments again. And that's been quite the lift for everyone involved in the system. We know from various credit monitoring companies and other news stories that the delinquency rate is up quite a bit, and that average score drops for those first 90-day late, delinquencies is 70 points for borrowers. Um, on top of that, we've got 8 million borrowers or so that are in what's called the SAVE forbearance. SAVE was the most generous of the IDR plans. It is caught up in litigation, and the borrowers that were in SAVE are just floating in SAVE forbearance right now, meaning there's no payment due, but they're not making progress towards forgiveness and interest is running. All of those borrowers are going to be switched into another plan or have to select another plan and start making monthly payments at some point. That will also be a big lift. On top of that, we also have OB3, which I mentioned before, the One Big Beautiful Bill or HR1, whatever you want to call it. And there's a lot of uncertainty and a little bit of fear, I'd say, around what that bill does, what that new law does for the student loan environment. Going forward, there won't be as many repayment plans available, and it won't be quite as borrower friendly as it was in the past for most borrowers. That's not a reason for people to stop making payments or check out of the system, but it is just one more element in this environment where borrowers are, somewhat untrusting of the system, distrustful of messaging, not very sure about their loans, haven't really been that plugged into them. I just saw a Reddit post today where someone said that they sort of lost track of their loans, got their first 90-month delinquency hitting their credit report, and it dropped their credit score by 200 points. How do I undo this? And the short answer is there isn't a good way to undo that. You have to make regular payments for years, and they'll eventually slide off your credit report. But in the meantime, your credit is very damaged. And that's just delinquency. That's not even default. So I know that I went, pretty fast through a lot of that, but I want to make sure that we're leaving enough time for any questions people might have. Um, you know, Default is it's very punitive, and that's sort of by design. The idea when the Higher Education Act was first made is that borrowers who default would sort of really be penalized because of how liberal the lending was on the front end and all the program options for when you're not in default, like deferment, forbearance, income-driven repayment. I think the culture has shifted somewhat on that. But unfortunately, some of the law and the mechanisms for collecting undefaulted debt hasn't. So it can be very hard on borrowers who don't understand it and are caught in default. So any questions, we can either do it verbally or in the chat.
Benjamin, so I also see questions that come in from borrowers, so I'll just throw out one of those that I've heard. So, how does this default environment relate to the different kinds of forgiveness options that people might have? So, whether it's because they're in a plan that might allow for forgiveness, or it's because of, permanent disability, or, one of the other categories for potential forgiveness.
Good question. For any of the sort of what I would call forgiveness options, so income-driven repayment forgiveness, public service loan forgiveness, also known as PSLF, your time in default doesn't count towards those forgiveness timelines. So you're essentially on pause in making any progress there. For what I would call more like discharge, which is like that total and permanent disability that you mentioned, discharge in my mind is more like when something bad happens. Um, you would still qualify for those while you're in default, but obviously you would have to know about them and apply for them. They don't tend to sort of just automatically happen. So, there's options for if you're in default and, if you're disabled or you think that borrower defense to repayment, which is when your school has broken the law, uh, things like that that might apply to you. They're still worth pursuing. Um, but really the in my mind the number one priority is get out of default and then simultaneously or right after pursue those discharges. um, Really getting out of default should be priority number one in almost all cases. Got a question. Beyond making consistent payments after defaulting, are there other credit repair services that can help for these situations? I'm not a credit repair specialist. I don't think that most companies or services in that space can really offer anything above and beyond what the servicers are going to do for the credit reporting anyway. I think delinquencies slide off after 2 years. I think for defaults, it's up to 7 years. The one thing I do want to mention, which I kind of rushed over in the slide deck, is for when you rehabilitate a loan, it actually removes the default from your credit score. That is important for some borrowers. The other methods of resolving default do not do that. So if removing a default is the most important thing, rehab is something folks should look into. The downside is that all the delinquency credit reporting that led up to your default, right? So from day 90 to day 270 or 360, all that does stay on your credit report. Now, delinquencies, again, they don't last as long as defaults, but it can still have a major impact to your credit. I don't have a good answer on if there's any sort of service or anything like that that could help. I think all of these servicers are used to borrowers sending in or requests for goodwill adjustments. I don't know how those are handled or what the sort of possible success rate is there. All of this is extremely automated, and I think everyone is generally treated the same for the most part. Good question.
I think there are, um, so for the issues of a borrower not being able to manage the payment, I think that there are resources, and again, I'm not one to say what they are, but resources that can help, I think, with your overall budgeting, and to figure out the best way to manage whatever your loan and debt obligations are.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of folks that had this payment as part of their budgets pre-pandemic, when you don't have to make a payment for 4 or 5 years, that's not part of your budget anymore. And now folks are trying to have to figure out how to reestablish that. It's difficult. And on top of that, the plans, Save was the most generous repayment plan. I was making payments under Save. I switched into IBR, my payment went up by, several $100s a month, not an insignificant amount of money at all.
Benjamin, I wanted to ask to follow up on a point that you made that people may have several loans, several trade lines, and then they also may not necessarily know that um, they're in delinquency or default. And it seems like they may not know that because their servicer doesn't have their current contact information.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, and if this is incorrect, let me know. But so if borrowers follow that first step, which is make sure that your contact information is current in terms of your email and your postal address and I guess your phone number, then is it true that a borrower should expect to see communications from their lender?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have your contact information up to date on studentaid.gov and then also with your servicer, if you start going delinquent, or even sometimes if you're even just a couple of days late, you should be getting messaging from your servicer and from studentaid.gov. Both of them should be messaging you, essentially checking in and wondering what's going on, giving you program options like deferment, forbearance. They're going to talk about IDR. Eventually, you would probably get outbound phone calls in addition to emails and letters, but that's usually more towards late stage delinquency. One more environmental thing, which I didn't really bring up on the slide deck, is that during the pandemic, the previous administration essentially let go of all the debt collection agencies that were contractors for the Department of Education on their portfolio of defaulted student loans. And that's a lot of institutional knowledge and a lot of people that were involved in that. As far as I'm aware, this current administration has not yet been able to hire back collection agencies, which means the department is not doing the same kind of robust outreach that they used to do to let borrowers know, like, hey, you're in default and you got to solve this somehow. Here's all your options. So it's more of a email and letter campaign now than it used to be. And it's relying more on borrowers to sort of see something and then call in or take some action on their own. But we know from this population that, in general, people default because they did not take action on their own, right? So asking them to sort of respond here with the same sort of communication channels is a big ask.
Is there a silver lining on this, the current environment that you see, Benjamin?
I mean, I don't know if I can say that there's a silver lining because I think, a lot of people's folks who have not been delinquent or defaulted in the past are going to go delinquent and or default, and there's not really any good individually or system wide that can come of that. Um, I we see the news stories and the sort of headlines about this. There's this glut of delinquencies occurring. I know servicers have been going to Capitol Hill and flagging that for politicians and saying we need some sort of solution here, some sort of, whether it's an amnesty or a one-time, something that's helped solve this. Hopefully, I guess my hope is that the damage and the actual defaults are not nearly as big as some folks are anticipating, and that even a slight bump will result in some sort of benefit or amnesty or some sort of acknowledgement that this is a problem that needs to be addressed rather than just hoping that it doesn't happen. Wish I could be sunnier on it, but
Well, yeah, just because our mission is to work with students before, during, and after. One thing I am noticing on the front end, anecdotally, but I'm hopeful that it's broader than just the anecdote, is a much stronger awareness from a lot of students of thinking about what those costs are, thinking about what debt is, and making a plan.
yeah, each the decision to take on student loan debt and for how much and for which types of degrees or credentials is extremely personal. In the past, I would say that not taking on enough debt was almost as bad of a problem because people wouldn't complete their degrees for fear of debt. Uh, then I think, there was lots of headlines and some of it was sort of clickbaity about people taking on way too much and then trying to have it all forgiven or taking on Parent Plus loans or Grad Plus. And, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. Um, there's a sweet spot, but it's different for everybody. So it's very hard to sort of give general guidance on like what type of debt and what makes sense in your individual situation.
Right. Um, so I can, as we wrap up here, I can, if you want to just share the next slide, Benjamin, I can just give a quick little preview. Well, so first of all, if you want to contact us, either with your student loan questions, the number there is on this slide. It's 833-589-0750, and that is a live helpline. It's confidential, staffed by trained professionals in student loan repayment questions, and that is staffed Monday through Friday from 8 to 4:30. And if you would prefer to email your question, there's an option for that too. So you can email at studentloanquestions@debtsmarts.org. Our website is debtsmarts.org. And we do have a lineup of upcoming webinars. If you go to the next screen, Benjamin, please. All right. So as you heard today, there are changes coming through the OB3, and so we will be continuing to monitor those changes as regulations get finalized, and make sure that that borrowers and Wisconsinites have the best and most current information about those student loan changes and how it may impact their situation. We will be doing also some interesting webinars coming up, AI strategies for finding scholarships. Another one that we have coming up on December 2nd is how to avoid scams, because it is the season for scams, and we will have a consumer protection expert who shares with us what to look for and how to avoid getting caught in a scam. All right. Well, thank you, Benjamin, for sharing your time and expertise, and thanks everyone for joining us today. This recording will be shared on our YouTube channel and also on our website. So you can share it around there with friends and colleagues who may have missed today's event. And then you can subscribe to our newsletter for the information about all of our upcoming events. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone.